Why did the soldiers always glance past her, as if she were a shadow that didn't belong? They called her a widow, never a warrior. To them, she was just a woman who clung to grief too long, a reminder of death they didn't want to carry. Boots pounded past her in the courtyards of forward operating base Alur, polished helmets gleaming under hard lights, laughter echoing like they had all the time in the world. And yet, whenever their eyes touched her, it was as though she had trespassed into a place reserved only for the living. Her name was Aravia. She had not spoken it aloud in months. She wasn't sure anyone else remembered it. The soldiers called her the widow, as though that was all she would ever be. Some muttered it with pity, some spat it with scorn, but none of them asked her what name her husband had whispered in their bed before he left for his last mission. None of them asked what it was like to sit with folded hands while a knock on the door took her whole future away. She remembered the day the army delivered the flag, how the cloth was pressed and perfect, as though precision could soften the brutality of the words. He died with honor. He fought bravely. We will never forget his sacrifice. But they did forget. That was the cruelest part. Darren Villa's name had been carved into a wooden memorial, spoken once at a ceremony with rifles cracking into the sky, and then buried under silence. For years, Ara lived close to that silence. Most women in her position fled the bases, fled the reminders of boots and rifles and barracks full of ghosts. She stayed. She chose the clatter of supply crates and the ink-stained weight of ledgers. Quartermaster, civilian contractor, invisible. If she worked in the shadows of soldiers, she could feel close to Darren's world, even if she wasn't welcome in it anymore. What none of them knew was that Darren's rifle had never left her. His old service-issued M110, scratched from years in the field, lay hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin. She cleaned it every week as though preparing it for an inspection that would never come. The way some people tended shrines, Ara tended steel. Her hands remembered the balance, the trigger's pressure, the rhythm of slow breath before a shot. Darren had taught her long ago, not because he foresaw his death, but because he had wanted her to know his world. Back then, she thought it was love. Now, she realized he had been giving her something far more enduring, the ability to stand when no one else would. But no one at Alur saw that. To them she was a paper pusher, a ghost, a fragile relic in a world of armored suits and digital weapons. Soldiers with visors that lit up with wind calculations, maps projected across their eyes, targeting systems that told them where to point their rifles. They believed themselves sharp, efficient, untouchable. They had never fought blind, and some of them laughed openly at Ara's ledgers, her crates, the quiet way she refused to disappear. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It hammered the tin roofs of the base like a war with no end. Ara sat alone in her cabin, hands around a photograph so worn the edges curled inward. Darren's smile stared back at her, the kind of smile that once made young recruits believe in impossible victories. She touched the faded corner of the picture with her thumb, whispering his name like a secret. And then the crackle came. A faint distortion in the radios that bled through the night. The comms tech brushed it off as weather interference from the storm, but Ara froze when she heard it. That sound, she knew it. She had heard it once before, the night before Darren's unit was ambushed and never returned. Her stomach knotted. Memory pressed down with the weight of inevitability. At 21:17, the first explosion tore through the outer wall. Alarms screamed. Boots thundered across metal grating. Shouts of contact, contact. North perimeter breached, filled the air. Ara dropped her pen. The ledger clattered onto the floor. The ground shook with a second blast and the power cut. Darkness swallowed the base as if the storm itself had decided to wage war. Soldiers rushed past her cabin, armored and armed, but their movements were frantic. Beneath the noise, she heard it not confidence, but panic. The automated defense turrets had gone silent, either jammed or destroyed. She pressed against the wall, heart pounding so loud she thought someone might hear it and mistake it for weakness. Colonel Ree's voice rose over the chaos, clipped and sharp. "Hold the southern gate. Evac the engineers. Get those comms back online. His eyes swept past Ara once, dismissed her as irrelevant, and snapped back to his men. It was always the same. She was the widow, not a soldier, not a fighter, just another civilian body to be shepherded toward safety. But orders had already failed her once. The day Darren never came home, she would not let orders fail her again. Her legs carried her before her mind caught up. She ran through sheets of rain, through the cacophony of boots and shouts and collapsing structures, back to her cabin. She ripped the boards from the floor, her hands raw with splinters, and lifted the case from its hiding place. The clasps clicked open. Inside, Darren's rifle gleamed faintly in the lantern light, not as a relic, not as a shrine, as a weapon. Her hands trembled once, only once. She whispered his name into the silence, Darren, and then she slung the rifle over her shoulder. By the time she returned to the armory, the soldiers were unraveling. Their visors dead, their rifles useless without digital overlays. Recruits who had mocked her minutes ago now stood wide-eyed, shouting into dead comms, their laughter gone. She walked past them, rain plastering her hair against her face, the rifle steady in her grip. "Look at that. Grandma's got a museum piece," one sneered, forcing a laugh he didn't believe. "Don't tell me she's gonna save us with that antique," another muttered. Ara didn't answer. She climbed the watchtower ladder, one rung after another, her boots heavy with mud, her resolve heavier still. The valley spread out before her, flames licking the ridgelines, shadows moving fast across the perimeter like predators. She set the rifle on its bipod, adjusted the scope. Inhale, exhale. Darren's voice lived in her breath. She marked the first target, an enemy crouched by the defense grid cutting wires. Distance, 800 meters. The recruits were right about one thing: the rifle was old, but old steel doesn't lie. She squeezed. The crack was soft, almost tender, like a whispered word. The man fell instantly. The second shot came before the first body hit the mud. The third followed with the same rhythm. Each time she didn't hesitate. Each time the rifle answered her grief with precision. Below her, soldiers froze. The chaos paused. They turned toward the tower where the widow stood, her silhouette cut against rain and fire. For the first time, they didn't laugh. The storm lashed harder. Smoke billowed from the barracks. Men shouted orders, half heard in the din, but Ara's calm settled over the field like a hand closing over panic. Through the scope, she saw everything. The battlefield was chaos to them, but to her it was clarity. The angles Darren had once traced in dust for her came alive now in rain and blood. Another figure emerged on the ridge with a launcher. She exhaled, squeezed, and stopped a fireball that should have leveled the gate. Gasps rippled through the men below. Colonel Ree shouted up at her, his voice raw. "You are not authorized to engage. Get down from there." But his words carried no weight anymore, not after what they had just seen. Her rifle spoke again. Another body fell exactly where she had said it would. And the soldiers realized something they had never wanted to admit. Survival now rested in the hands of the widow they had ignored. Her voice carried calm across the commotion. "Two squads moving from the east tree line. Hold your fire until my mark." The men hesitated. Ree barked a counterorder, but doubt had already cracked open. They had seen her truth through the scope of her rifle. Now she commanded. Dozens of rifles erupted in unison. The enemy squad collapsed, mud and blood scattering. Silence followed, not laughter, not mockery, silence. For years they had called her the widow like it was weakness. Tonight, the name began to change. Tonight, it became something else. Rain streaked her face like war paint. Her shoulders did not shake. Her eyes did not flinch. She had picked up her husband's rifle, and the world had just learned. Grief can forge steel sharper than any blade. How long could one woman hold the weight of an entire base? That was the question hanging in the rain-soaked silence after her third shot. Soldiers stared up at the watchtower like they were seeing a ghost that had decided not to haunt, but to fight. Some looked at her with awe, others with fear, but all of them knew one truth now. Their survival was tied to the widow with the rifle. Colonel Ree's face twisted in the glow of firelight, drenched and furious. He bellowed her name as though authority alone could drag her down, but Ara barely heard him. Her world was the glass of the scope, the rhythm of her chest, the line between silence and thunder. Another enemy crouched behind sandbags, radio pressed to his mouth. She waited for the faint lift of his head, the moment of certainty. Exhale, crack, silence. Gasps rippled below her. One young corporal muttered, "She just saved the whole gate." Another whispered, "That shot was impossible." She reloaded calmly, the motion automatic, her breath steady. She didn't care for their awe. She didn't fight for their admiration. She fought because the storm had left her no other choice. But in that moment, Ara realized something that unsettled her more than any enemy on the ridge. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. For years she had lived bent under the weight of silence, convinced that grief had stolen her strength. Yet now, in the crack of a rifle and the chaos of fire, she felt alive. The widow was no longer surviving. She was fighting. The night pressed on, heavy with smoke. From the tower, Ara saw soldiers scrambling between bunkers, their digital rifles useless, their exosuits dark without guidance from satellites. They had been trained to rely on machines. Tonight, stripped of that comfort, they were blind, and blind men die fast. Through the scope, she saw the enemy move like shadows, exploiting every weakness, every blind corner. They had studied this base. They knew its vulnerabilities. They had come for more than victory. They had come to expose just how fragile technology had made them. "Hold fire until I mark," Ara called out again, voice steady, cutting through the storm like a blade. She could see them hesitate, caught between her command and the colonel's barked orders. Pride battled desperation in the mud below. But then her rifle cracked once more, striking an enemy crawling toward the southern gate, exactly where she said they would be. Conviction spread like fire. One soldier lifted his rifle without waiting for permission, then another. Then the line came alive. Dozens of rifles thundered together, cutting down a wave of silhouettes charging from the tree line. Mud splashed. Screams echoed into the night. Then silence again. The chaos stilled, the fear ebbed. For the first time that night they were not running, they were standing. Colonel Ree's jaw clenched. His pride trembled on the edge of collapse. He wanted control, but control had already shifted. In the space between silence and fire, Ara's voice had become command. Minutes blurred into hours, hours blurred into heartbeats. Ara guided units with precision, calling angles, predicting movements, teaching men how to fight without the crutch of machines. A private crouched trembling behind sandbags. She adjusted his barrel with her hand, whispering, "Trust your breath, not your screen." When his bullet struck true, the shock on his face nearly cracked Ara's resolve. For years she had been invisible. Now she was indispensable. By 2 in the morning the rain slowed, but the enemy did not. Mortars rained from the ridgeline, turning earth to fire. The barracks collapsed in flames. Soldiers scrambled, fear rising again like floodwater. Ara climbed down from the tower, mud splashing around her boots. Her rifle never wavered. She strode through chaos as though it could not touch her, and found the colonel with desperation written across his face. "Colonel," she said firmly, meeting his eyes for the first time, "you've lost comms, you've lost your tech, but you haven't lost your men. Let me lead the marks. You hold the line." His jaw tightened. Pride fought him, gnawed at him, but desperation won. He gave a single sharp nod. "You get one chance, widow, don't waste it." She turned to the soldiers gathered nearby. Their faces were smeared with dirt and rain, eyes wide and waiting. For years they had mocked her. Tonight they would follow her. She raised the rifle high above her head. "Listen to me," her voice cut through the storm. "You don't need machines to fight. You need each other. You need your eyes, your hands, your courage. That's how we win." Something shifted in the mud-soaked courtyard. Shoulders straightened. Chins lifted. For the first time they believed. The next assault came harder than any before. Enemy vehicles tore across the field, mounted guns blazing. Soldiers ducked, shielding themselves from the storm of fire. But Ara stood tall in the open. She dropped to one knee, steadied her rifle, and exhaled. The world narrowed to pulse, scope, storm. Crack, the driver of the lead vehicle slumped. The machine veered into mud, useless. Crack, crack. Two gunners fell from their turrets. Panic rippled through the enemy lines. Behind her, a private shouted, "She's breaking them." Another yelled, "Stay with the widow." The name spread like wildfire. The widow of war. No longer a ghost of grief, but a force made of flesh and breath. By dawn, the ground was littered with broken rifles and silence. The enemy retreated, shadows slipping back into the ridges. Smoke curled upward, painting the sky with memory. Ara lowered her rifle. For the first time that night, her shoulders trembled. She looked at the faces around her, soldiers muddy, exhausted, alive. Their eyes no longer mocked her. They saluted her. Even Colonel Ree stepped forward, rain dripping from his brow. His voice cracked with sincerity. "Staff Sergeant Villa, tonight you carried this base." She returned his salute steady. She did not smile. Inside, her heart whispered Darren's name. He had prepared her for this moment. She was no longer just his widow. She was his legacy, living and breathing, carrying forward what he had left behind. Morning came gray and unyielding. Medics moved among the wounded. Engineers stared at their broken turrets with the shame of men who had trusted machines to be brave in their place. Ara cleaned her husband's rifle with slow, deliberate strokes, each pass of the cloth pulling night away like thin black scars. Soldiers lingered nearby, pretending to need water, tape, anything at all, just to stand close enough to speak what pride had once silenced. A young corporal swallowed hard before words tumbled out. "Ma'am, you adjusted my sights. I hit what I aimed at. You hit what you believed." She glanced up at him, her voice calm. "That's the harder target." Across the yard, Colonel Ree stood before a wall of clean uniforms from headquarters. They wrote notes, asked clipped questions, labeled disasters with technical names, jamming sophistication, system sabotage, weather interference. But when they were gone, Ree crossed to Ara, carrying something he hadn't worn in years: humility. "We'll call it a comms failure," he muttered. "We'll assign fault, push reports, but the truth, courage held this base. Yours, I was wrong about you." Ara didn't nod. She didn't thank him. She simply wiped the rifle clean and answered, "If the enemy could do this once, they'll do it again. We can't afford to forget how to fight without screens." Ree followed her gaze. Young recruits stood listening, faces unguarded, hungry for something real. He let out a breath. "Then you'll teach them." She set the rifle down. Her hands were steady. "I'll teach what was taught to me." And so it began. Training on the dirt, not the screens. Stones in the mud instead of glowing targets. Lessons in patience, silence, breath. Ara's voice shaping soldiers who had once mocked her into men who now hung on every word. She showed them how to read wind with cheek and jaw. How to trust grass leaning before it whispered. How the trigger wasn't a command, but a question you asked the world, and only fired when it answered honestly. And as dusk fell, their bullets struck true, not because of machines, but because of themselves. That night, silence carried a different weight. It wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of men learning respect. How much can silence teach? That was the question on every recruit's face as they stood in the mud with rifles heavier than their pride. No glowing targets, no digital overlays, just Ara's voice, calm, deliberate, relentless. She told them to watch grass lean in the wind until their impatience burned itself out. She told them to feel gusts on their skin like whispers too soft for machines to hear. And she told them the truth most of them had never considered, that the world did not bend to their convenience. It bent only to honesty. Some of the young men laughed at first, the nervous laughter of those clinging to the comfort of what they once knew. But laughter dies quickly when silence refuses to leave. One by one, they quieted. One by one, they began to listen. Ara drew lines in the dirt with a stick, simple arcs showing how wind would drag a bullet off its path. She placed stones where she knew the air would betray them. "You're waiting for the wind to be fair," she told them. "Stop. Wait for it to be honest." The recruits frowned, confused. One private muttered, "What does that even mean?" But when he pulled his trigger too soon, the bullet skipped wide, smacking into earth like a scolding hand. Ara only said, "The wind told you who it was. You lied about it. That's why you missed." The young man lowered his eyes. The others listened harder. By evening, bullets began to strike true. Not every shot, not most, but enough to make the men realize that silence had value, enough to make them believe that patience could be sharper than technology. Colonel Ree watched from a distance, arms folded, expression unreadable. Ara didn't care. She hadn't come to prove herself to him. She had come to keep these men alive. At dusk, the names of the dead from the night's attack were read aloud. The base stood in formation, silence pressing heavy on every chest. Ara lingered at the edge, eyes fixed on the memorial board where Darren's name had been carved years ago. Colonel Ree stepped beside her, voice lower than the wind. "I used to talk to this wall," he admitted, "when I didn't know what to tell living men." She didn't turn her head, and what did it say back? "That being brave and being right are cousins," he said, "but they don't always attend the same funerals." For the first time in years, Ara almost smiled. "He would have liked that," she whispered. Ree cleared his throat. "My headquarters wants you on a staff. Instructor billet, clean halls, capital letters, you'd never touch mud again." Ara's hand brushed the stock of the rifle. Her fingers lingered on a burn mark Darren had once called the moon that never forgets. She shook her head. "Mud remembers. Offices forget. My place is here. My students are here." The colonel didn't argue. He only nodded, a man grateful to be outranked by truth. 2 days later, the enemy struck again. The convoy had been simple on paper, 3 transport trucks carrying evacuees and a field surgeon through Rook's Pass. A slit in the mountains, narrow, treacherous, with switchbacks that twisted like a serpent. Ara's chest tightened the moment she heard the call. Rook's Pass was patience made into stone. She knew it too well. Darren had once taught her its secrets under snow, showing her how wind curved bullets around granite walls. When the ambush came, it came with cruelty. The first burst shredded the lead truck's tire. The second stitched gravel where terrified feet tried to scatter. The pass was a funnel, and the funnel had teeth. Colonel Ree turned to Ara before the radio finished stuttering. He didn't ask. He simply said, "You know the pass." She was already slinging the rifle across her shoulder. "Snow taught me more than rain ever could," she said. Malik, the base's tech specialist, jumped into the transport with a toolbox clutched like hope. And Yara, the young corporal who once mocked Ara and now followed her like a shadow, climbed in with a squad, faces pale but resolute. The convoy climbed the switchbacks, every corner tighter than the last. Halfway up, Ree tried the comms net. The silence that answered was heavier than static. The enemy had learned patience. They didn't jam, they simply waited. Ara moved ahead on foot, boots crunching gravel, rain dripping from jagged stone walls. She crouched low, pressed her palm to the earth, and let the wind tell its secrets. A lift on the left wall, a dead pocket behind a stunted pine, a seam of granite that would drag bullets like water in a river's bend. She saw it all. Darren had once made her watch snowflakes drift in that same pass until she could predict which ones would fall flat and which would dance on the wind. 2 above the bend, she murmured. 1 in the scree slope, 1 behind us waiting, and a patient one somewhere waiting for us to prove we're afraid. Ree glanced at the shallow ditch that offered little cover, his jaw flexed. "We are afraid." Ara steadied the rifle on the ground. "Then today you'll be quiet and right, not brave, not loud, just right." She sent Yara's squad climbing the left wall where the wind would lie in their favor. She sent Malik into a ravine with orders to listen for the scrape of metal more than the shuffle of boots. She lay prone in the open road, plain as truth, and waited. The patient one revealed himself in the faintest shift of weight behind a boulder. Ara asked permission with her breath, pulled the trigger, and ended him without anger. The scree gunner panicked, spraying bullets that dislodged rocks onto his own allies. Yara's squad moved like ink through water, no splash, all consequence. In 6 heartbeats, the ambush came apart at its hinges, like a gate shot loose from its pins. They reached the convoy. A child screamed and then cried with the relief of a throat no longer holding its terror inside. The surgeon clutched Ara's arm, eyes wet. "I told them someone would come," she whispered. "I didn't know it would be a ghost." Ara met her eyes. "I'm no ghost, just a wife who learned to live forward." Rhys stared at her like he was seeing more than a soldier, more than a widow. He was seeing a doctrine no machine could replace. "We can't write this down fast enough," he muttered. "And even if we do, someone will print it on a screen until it forgets how to breathe." "Then we'll keep breathing," Ara said, "and we'll keep teaching." They rolled out of the pass with evacuees safe, wounded tended, and a squad of soldiers who had just learned that courage was not a chip you installed, but a choice you made. Halfway down the mountain, a drone shadow passed across the road, silent, watchful, sent by someone far away who thought distance equaled wisdom. It didn't fire. It only watched. Ara stared back until it became a dot, then a thought, then nothing. At the base, a courier waited with an envelope heavy enough to tip scales. Ara opened it on the bumper of a truck still smelling of fear. Inside was a letter on headquarters paper, offering rank in schools and futures with chairs. Behind it, tucked like a secret, was a smaller letter in handwriting she knew better than her own. Darren. Her hands trembled for the first time since the battle. The ink was worn, the words simple. "If this ever reaches you, it means the world asked for more than your grief. Give it what it asks, Ara, not because of me, because of you." She folded both letters, slipped them into her jacket, and turned toward the recruits waiting nearby. Their faces were raw with questions, hungry for truth. "Tomorrow," she said, voice steady, "at first light." The young corporal asked softly, "What are we learning?" She glanced at the rifle, at the wind, at their faces. "How to make silence louder than laughter," she said. "How to be brave and be right on the same day." The recruits leaned in, listening. For the first time, Ara felt the future shift, not toward grief, but toward legacy. Why did they follow her so easily now, when once they laughed? That question lingered in Ara's mind even as she stood before the recruits at dawn, the rifle slung across her shoulder like a truth that refused to be denied. Their eyes searched her face, waiting for words the way frightened children wait for firelight in the dark. She wondered if they followed her because they trusted her, or because fear had broken their faith in every other leader they had. The parade ground was slick with rain. Soldiers gathered not with arrogance but with the heavy humility of men who had seen death too close and survived by grace, not by skill. Ara didn't give them speeches. She gave them silence. She let it stretch until they shifted uneasily, until the sound of their own breathing became louder than their doubts. Finally she spoke. "Last night you learned that technology fails. Wind doesn't, breath doesn't, neither do your eyes." She picked up a handful of dirt, let it fall through her fingers. The breeze caught it, scattering it sideways. "The world is always telling you the truth. If you miss, it's because you weren't listening." The recruits leaned forward, as if her words carried more weight than the rifles on their backs. Yara, the corporal who once sneered, now repeated her phrases under her breath like scripture. Malik, the tech specialist who once worshipped circuits and signals, watched silently with a headset hanging loose around his neck. Training became ritual. No glowing targets, no range timers. Stones stood in the mud where Ara said the wind would betray them. Soldiers lay prone in the dirt until stillness stopped being discomfort and became weapon. Their complaints faded over days, replaced by quiet determination. When one missed a shot, Ara asked only one question: "What did you lie about?" At first they didn't understand. Then they did. They lied about patience. They lied about fear. They lied about listening. One by one they stopped lying. Colonel Ree watched all of it from a distance. His pride kept him silent, but his eyes betrayed something else. Respect, reluctant but growing. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, Ara walked the perimeter alone. The base was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed on her chest with memory. She thought of Darren, of the nights they had spent in silence together, his hand steady on her back as he taught her to breathe between shots. He used to say silence was the purest form of honesty. She understood now. Silence didn't flatter. Silence didn't excuse. It revealed. She paused by the memorial wall. Her fingers traced Darren's name, worn by years of weather. She whispered, "I carried it forward, love, just like you asked." Her voice trembled, but her hands did not. The following morning the base was tested again, not by direct assault but by whispers. Reports trickled in of enemy patrols circling the outskirts, not striking, not retreating, waiting. It was the kind of waiting Ara recognized too well. Patience was the cruelest weapon. It frayed nerves, drained strength, made men question themselves before a single shot was fired. Recalled his officers into the command tent, voices overlapping in panicked debate. Should they strike first? Should they fortify? Should they evacuate civilians deeper into the valley? Ara stood outside, listening to the chaos spill through the canvas walls. Once, she would have been ignored, dismissed as a quartermaster with no place in strategy. Tonight, soldiers passed her with subtle nods, waiting for her word as much as the colonel's. She didn't want power, she wanted truth. And truth was simple: fear would kill them faster than bullets. She walked to the training yard where recruits lingered, restless. Their rifles hung at their sides, their shoulders tight with anticipation. She picked up a stone, set it on the dirt, and sat cross-legged before it. "Wait with me," she said. Confused, they obeyed. Minutes passed. Wind tugged at the stone. Grass bent and whispered. The recruits shifted, restless. One finally blurted, "What are we waiting for?" "The truth," Ara answered. The wind lifted, spun the stone, settled it back down. A gust whistled through the grass. And suddenly they understood. The enemy was patient, but so were they. When the alarm finally screamed, they were ready. The attack came not at the gates, but at the supply convoys stretched along the valley road. Explosions lit the dawn, fire tearing through crates and trucks. Soldiers scrambled, shouting, some already breaking formation. Ara ran into the smoke, rifle steady, heart hammering. Through the haze, she saw the enemy's strategy: choke the base by starving it, not storming it. "Marks to the ridgeline," she shouted. "Don't waste your fire, let them reveal themselves." Colonel Ree barked orders too, but his words were drowned by chaos. The soldiers had a choice: follow him or follow her. They chose her. The first enemy sniper cracked a shot that clipped a young private's helmet. The boy froze, trembling. Ara knelt beside him, calm as stone. "Breathe," she whispered. "You already know where he is, trust your eyes." Together they watched the shift of dust on the ridge, the way grass quivered under weight. The private pulled the trigger. The shot landed. His eyes went wide, disbelief flooding his face. Ara nodded once. "That's truth." The battle raged for hours. Bullets tore through smoke, fire split the valley, but something shifted in the soldiers' hearts. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove they were more than their machines. By noon, the enemy retreated, leaving the road scarred but the base supplied. Soldiers collapsed in the mud, exhausted but alive. Colonel Ree approached Ara, his uniform torn, his pride battered. "They follow you," he admitted, voice raw. "They don't follow me anymore." Ara met his eyes. "Then stop trying to be followed. Start standing with them." For once, Ree didn't argue. He simply nodded, the lesson carving deeper than orders ever could. That night the base gathered in silence. No speeches, no ceremonies, just soldiers sitting together in the mud, listening to the wind. Ara sat with them, rifle across her knees, eyes distant. She felt Darren's presence like a shadow at her back, not haunting, guiding. Yara broke the silence, voice soft. "Ma'am, why didn't you leave after he died? Why stay near all this?" Ara's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken the answer aloud before. "Because grief is loudest when you run from it. I stayed because silence weighs less when you carry it close." The recruits exchanged glances, something shifting in them. Respect, understanding. Later, when the base finally slept, Ara lay awake. The enemy had tested their patience today. Tomorrow they would test something else. She didn't know what, but she knew this. Silence had prepared her for every storm so far. It would prepare her again. And as she closed her eyes, Darren's voice lingered in memory, softer than the wind. "The world will ask you for more than grief. Give it what it asks." What happens when a ghost becomes a leader? That was the unspoken question across the base in the days after the convoy ambush and the supply line attack. Aravilla, once just the widow, the invisible quartermaster, now stood at the center of every whisper, every sidelong glance, every hushed conversation between soldiers who had once mocked her. They followed her without asking why. They trusted her without daring to admit it aloud. But Ara did not feel like a leader. Not in the way she had watched Darren lead, with his wide smile and unwavering certainty. Her leadership came from silence, from patience, from grief that had burned into steel. It was not glory that held their attention. It was survival, and survival was never loud. Each dawn, she gathered the recruits on the training field. She made them lie flat in mud until the earth seeped through their uniforms and into their bones. She made them count breaths until the rhythm of life itself steadied their hands. She made them miss shots, fail deliberately, so they would understand humility before they ever understood victory. Malik, once chained to his headsets and screens, now stood barefoot in the dirt with the others, his hands open to the wind like he was learning to pray all over again. He muttered once, "I built sermons to blinking lights. Maybe it's time I build a chapel to listening." Ara surprised herself by answering, "Build both, just don't worship either." The men laughed quietly, not mockery this time but respect. Evenings were harder. Evenings carried the names of the dead. At dusk, the soldiers formed lines, heads bowed, and the roll call of the fallen echoed against broken walls. Ara always stood apart, her eyes fixed on Darren's photo nailed to the memorial board. She listened to the silence after each name, a silence that perched over them like a permanent witness. Colonel Reed joined her once, his voice low. "Headquarters doesn't understand what's happening here. They think you're an anomaly, a temporary solution." Ara's jaw tightened. "And what do you think?" He exhaled slowly, rain dripping from his brow. "I think we forgot what war actually is. We thought we could replace courage with circuits. You reminded us that fear still bleeds, that patience still kills, and that men need more than glowing screens to stand." She glanced at him, green eyes steady. "Then stop calling me an anomaly. Start calling me what I am." Ree held her gaze, then nodded once. "Staff Sergeant Villa, that's who you are." The title settled heavy on her shoulders, heavier than the rifle she carried. Not because she sought it, but because it meant responsibility she could never set down again. The next test came faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks after the supply ambush, scouts reported enemy fortifications rising in the hills. Trenches, heavy guns, camouflaged nests dug into ridgelines that overlooked the valley. It was not a probing raid. It was preparation. They meant to come again, harder, bigger, determined to erase the shame of their earlier retreat. Ree called for a briefing. Maps spread across tables. Officers argued, their voices thick with fear disguised as strategy. Evacuate civilians. Strike the ridges before they hardened. Hold ground and hope for reinforcements. Ara stood in the back, silent. She remembered the first time she'd been in a briefing like this, Darren beside her, his hand squeezing hers under the table as commanders dismissed her presence. She had been invisible then. Tonight, soldiers turned toward her, waiting. Ree saw it too, his jaw clenched. "Staff Sergeant Villa," he said finally, "what do you see?" She stepped forward, her voice calm, her words deliberate. "They want us to panic. They want us to leave the valley so they can claim it without firing a shot. If we strike too early, we walk into their patience. If we stay blind, we hand them the high ground. So we listen first. Watch. Make them reveal themselves." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One protested, "That's not doctrine." Ree cut him off. "Doctrine didn't hold this base last time. She did. We'll listen." And so they waited. For 3 nights, Ara led small patrols into the hills. Silent, cautious, eyes sharper than sensors. They mapped wind currents, watched how shadows shifted at dawn, marked where enemy scouts moved too often. They didn't fire. They didn't fight. They simply listened. The soldiers grew restless. Waiting felt like weakness to men raised on speed and action. But Ara's patience was iron. She reminded them, the enemy believes patience belongs to them. Prove them wrong. On the 4th night, the trap revealed itself. Enemy gunners tried to bait them with small fire from the east ridge. Ara held her men back, eyes fixed on dust drifting along the western slope. The faintest shift betrayed hidden nests waiting for the base to respond. She smiled, the kind of grim smile Darren once wore. "They're showing us their hand," she whispered. "Now we answer." She ordered her marks to wait for her signal. Minutes stretched, hearts pounded. Then the wind shifted. Grass leaned, betraying silhouettes in the dark. Ara's shot broke the silence. A clean strike. Her recruits followed, rifles cracking in unison. The hidden nests fell apart before they could fire a coordinated volley. The enemy faltered, their patience broken. They retreated into the ridges, dragging wounded, leaving weapons behind. Ara lowered her rifle, breath steady. When they returned to the base, soldiers erupted in cheers. Not wild, drunken cheers, but the quiet, reverent cheer of men who realized they had just survived, because they had listened to a widow who refused to be silent. Ree stood at the gate watching them. When Ara approached, he saluted her, not as a token, not as a show, as respect. "You carried them again," he said. Ara shook her head. "No, they carried themselves. I just reminded them they could." The following weeks transformed the base. Where once the air had been filled with the hum of calibrating machines, now it rang with the crack of rifles and the whisper of wind. Soldiers learned to steady their hands without digital ghosts. They learned patience, humility, silence. And in the center of it all, Ara stood like a tree rooted in both grief and defiance. But leadership is a burden. At night, when the base fell into uneasy sleep, Ara sat alone with Darren's rifle across her knees. She cleaned it with slow, careful strokes, each pass a prayer she didn't know how to speak aloud. She whispered his name into the darkness. Sometimes she wondered if she was becoming what he had prepared her to be, or if she was losing the last pieces of herself in the process. One evening, Yara approached quietly, hesitant. "Ma'am," she said, voice low, "I need to ask, do you ever regret picking up his rifle?" Ara's hands froze. The question hung in the air heavier than rain. Finally, she whispered, "Every day." Yara's brow furrowed. "Then why?" "Because regret doesn't free you from responsibility," Ara said softly. "Regret just reminds you that you're still human. I carry both, and I keep walking." The young corporal nodded, eyes wide, as though hearing something she would carry for the rest of her life. That night, Ara lay awake staring at the ceiling, Darren's voice echoing in her mind. "The world will ask you for more than grief. Give it what it asks." And in the distance, thunder rolled through the mountains. She knew it wasn't weather. The enemy hadn't given up. They had only begun. What happens when silence isn't enough? That question gnawed at Ara as she stood at the edge of the base, watching lightning cut through the black horizon. Only this wasn't lightning. It was artillery, distant but deliberate, the kind of thunder that carried promises of fire. The enemy wasn't probing anymore. They were coming. Not as shadows slipping through ridges, but as a storm that meant to wash the base away. The night before the assault, Ara sat alone in her cabin, Darren's rifle laid across her knees. She ran the cloth along its barrel, the ritual steady, precise, unbroken. It should have calmed her. It didn't. For the first time in weeks, her hands shook. Not because of fear of dying, she had carried death in her shadow for too long to fear it. What unsettled her was the fear of failing the men who now trusted her. She had not asked for them to follow, but they did. And now every breath they took seemed balanced on her shoulders. A knock at the door startled her. Yara stepped in, dripping from the rain, eyes hard with worry. "Ma'am, scouts report armor, vehicles, heavy guns. They're not testing us this time. They mean to end us." Ara set the rifle aside, her voice calm though her pulse hammered. "Then we end their certainty first." Dawn came gray, heavy with mist. Soldiers gathered in the yard, tension thick, rifles clutched like lifelines. Colonel Ree barked orders, his voice carrying authority but not conviction. The men's eyes slid past him to Ara. She didn't stand on a platform. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked among them, steady, deliberate, her presence anchoring what fear threatened to unravel. "They'll come loud," she told them. "They'll come certain. They think we'll scatter. We won't. We'll make the noise work for us." "How?" a private asked, voice cracking. Ara knelt, scooping mud into her palm. "Noise hides truth. Watch for what doesn't move with it. That's your enemy. That's where you shoot." The men listened, their fear bending into focus. When the first shells hit, the ground shuddered like the earth itself had flinched. Barracks crumbled. Fences twisted. Fire leapt high, tearing through rain. Soldiers dove for cover, shouting over the roar. Colonel Ree's voice vanished in the storm. Ara didn't dive. She stood in the open, Darren's rifle braced against her shoulder, scanning through smoke. Shadows moved between fire bursts, fast, low, deliberate. She inhaled, exhaled, crack. One fell. She shifted, breath steady. Crack. Another dropped. The men saw her, and in the chaos, steadiness spread like fire. They rose, found courage in her calm, and returned fire. Not wild, not frantic, focused. Enemy vehicles tore across the field, guns blazing. Ara dropped to one knee, mud splashing up her legs. The world narrowed to pulse, scope, storm, crack. A driver slumped. The machine veered uselessly. Crack. A gunner fell. Another vehicle faltered. But for everyone she struck, another roared forward. Explosions tore craters in the yard. Soldiers screamed. Medics scrambled. The storm was endless. And then, for the first time, Ara hesitated. Through the scope, she saw a figure crouched behind a mounted gun, young, barely more than a boy. His face turned toward her in the flicker of firelight, eyes wide, terrified. He couldn't have been older than Yara. Her finger froze on the trigger. The boy shook as though the weapon in his hands was heavier than his whole body. Ara's breath caught. Darren's voice whispered in her memory, "The trigger isn't a command, it's a question. You only pull when the world says yes." But what if the world gave no answer? The hesitation lasted only seconds, long enough for another shell to slam into the gate, long enough for men behind her to scream. Yara shouted from the trench, "Ma'am, we need you." Ara exhaled hard, she shifted, fired, the boy crumpled. The shot landed true, but the silence afterward cut deeper than any scream. She lowered the rifle, hands trembling. For the first time since she had picked up Darren's weapon, she felt the weight of every life she had taken pressing down on her chest. She wanted to tell herself it was survival, necessity, war. But necessity didn't erase the memory of the boy's terrified eyes. The battle raged on. Ara fought, but her focus blurred. Each shot felt heavier, slower, harder to justify. Yet the soldiers still followed her, still cheered her calm, still believed. They didn't see the fracture opening inside her. They only saw the legend they had made her into. By dusk, the enemy retreated, their assault broken, their dead scattered across the mud. The base still stood, scarred but unfallen. Soldiers raised their fists, voices raw with relief. "The widow of war, the widow," they shouted. Ara stood among them, face streaked with mud and rain, her rifle heavy in her hands. She did not join their cheer. She turned away, walked alone to the watchtower and climbed until she was above them all. She sat there as night fell, staring into the valley, her breath unsteady, her chest hollow. Colonel Ree climbed up after her, slower, older, his boots dragging against the ladder. He sat beside her in silence, the storm echoing in the distance. Finally, he said, "They'd be dead without you." Ara shook her head. "One of them is dead because of me." Ree frowned. "We're at war." She clenched her fists. He was a boy, he wasn't ready. I saw it in his eyes, and I still pulled the trigger. Ree's gaze hardened. "If you hadn't, a dozen of ours would be gone instead. You chose." She whispered, "It doesn't feel like choosing. It feels like losing slower." Ree didn't answer. He only put a hand on her shoulder, heavy, awkward, almost fatherly. "You carry it so they don't have to. That's leadership, ugly as it is." Ara closed her eyes. Darren's voice whispered again in memory, "Give the world what it asks." But tonight she wondered if the world was asking for too much. The following days she trained harder than ever, pushing recruits until they collapsed in mud. She wasn't punishing them. She was punishing herself. Each lesson sharper, each correction harder, each silence heavier. The men grew sharper, braver, freer. But at night, Ara sat alone with her regret, whispering apologies into the dark, apologies no one could hear. One evening, Malik found her at the edge of the yard, staring into the wind. "You look like you're carrying ghosts," he said softly. "I am," she answered. Malik hesitated, then set his headset down in the dirt. "I used to think machines carried truth. They don't, people do, and it breaks them, but maybe that's what makes it truth." Ara looked at him, surprised by the weight of his words. For the first time in days she felt something ease in her chest, not forgiveness, not peace, but understanding. Still, she knew the storm wasn't done. The enemy hadn't retreated for good. They had tasted her defiance and they would come again, stronger, smarter, more ruthless. And when they did, she would have to choose again, not just between life and death, but between what kind of leader she would be. Would she remain the widow of war, carrying ghosts until they buried her too? Or would she find a way to live forward, not just for Darren, not just for her men, but for herself? The question lingered in the silence, a silence heavier than any storm. How many battles can a heart survive before it breaks? Ara asked herself that question as she walked the perimeter in the cold pre-dawn hours, boots sinking into damp earth, rifle slung over her shoulder like a memory she couldn't put down. The base was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that waits for something, a breath before the storm, a silence before the world shatters again. The men sensed it too. They trained harder, slept lighter, their nerves stretched thin. Even their laughter, the little they allowed themselves, sounded brittle, like glass that could crack at any moment. They looked to Ara with eyes that begged her to be more than she was, to be certainty, to be the one who never trembled. They didn't see the cracks inside her. They weren't meant to. Colonel Ree found her by the watchtower, arms crossed, his face drawn and weary. "Scouts report massing troops," he said. "Bigger than anything we've seen. They're coming with armor, mortars, drones, and infantry, all at once." Ara nodded, her expression unreadable. "They mean to break us." Ree's voice hardened. "Then we break their belief first." By nightfall, the valley glowed with fire. Enemy artillery thundered from the ridges, shaking earth and bone. Drones circled overhead, their red eyes blinking like watchful stars. Soldiers scrambled, shouting, fear clawing at the edges of their discipline. Ara climbed the tower, her vantage point, her altar of silence. From there, the battlefield stretched before her, a canvas painted in chaos and smoke. She steadied her rifle, breath deep, shoulders square. The men below glanced up, saw her silhouette against the flames, and steadied themselves in turn. The first wave came hard, infantry pouring down the slopes like a black tide, rifles blazing. Automated turrets groaned to life, then died again in bursts of sparks. The enemy had learned. They jammed the machines, silenced the technology. but they couldn't silence Aura. "Inhale, exhale," she whispered to herself. Crack. One fell. Crack. Another. Her shots cut clean through the tide, each one a lesson carried from Darren's voice to her hands, from her silence to their survival. But there were too many. The enemy pressed harder, their armor grinding forward, their mortars raining down. Soldiers ducked, cursed, faltered. Fear surged. Ara's voice cut through the storm. "Hold, watch the wind, trust what you see." Her words steadied them. The line stiffened. Rifles roared back in unison. Mud sprayed. Men screamed. The air filled with the bitter scent of cordite and rain. Still the tide pressed closer. Yara sprinted to Ara's tower, face streaked with grime and sweat. "Ma'am, they're flanking east. If they break through there." Ara didn't let her finish. "Take a squad, cut them off, trust the ground, trust each other." Yara nodded once, no hesitation, and vanished into smoke with her men. Ara turned back to the scope, her pulse steady despite the chaos below. Crack, crack, each shot a heartbeat, each heartbeat a vow. But then the sky split. A drone, larger than any they had seen, swooped low, its mounted cannon tearing holes into bunkers, ripping men apart in bursts of fire. Panic surged like a wave. Soldiers dove for cover, their rifles useless against the armored predator above. For a moment, even Ara faltered. Her rifle wasn't built for the sky. She couldn't reach it. She couldn't stop it. Her hands trembled. For the first time since she had picked up Darren's rifle, she felt powerless. Then Darren's voice echoed in her memory, softer than wind. "The world will ask you for more than you think you can give. Give it anyway." Ara's jaw tightened. She scanned the battlefield, searching, calculating. The drone swept low again, banking near a crumbling tower. For a split second, its belly turned, exposing a seam. Narrow, distant, nearly impossible. She inhaled, exhaled, the world slowed. Her breath became the only sound she heard. Crack! The shot cut through storm and smoke, striking the seam. Sparks burst. The drone jolted, shuddered, then spiraled into the mud in a fireball that lit the valley. The soldiers erupted in cheers, voices hoarse with disbelief. She brought it down. The widow brought it down. But Ara didn't cheer. She reloaded, calm, deliberate. The battle wasn't over, not yet. The second wave came harder, enemy vehicles grinding forward, guns blazing. Ara shifted targets, dropping drivers one by one, slowing the machines, turning their momentum into wreckage. Behind her, soldiers shouted in rhythm with her shots, their courage tethered to her calm. Still the enemy pressed closer. The gate buckled, the walls cracked. For every enemy that fell, another rose. Colonel Ree shouted from the courtyard, his voice raw. "If they break through, it's over." Ara descended the tower, boots slamming against the rungs, rifle tight in her grip. She strode into the courtyard, mud splashing up her legs, rain streaking her face like war paint. Soldiers gathered around her, eyes wide, waiting. She raised the rifle high. "Listen to me, they think we're machines. They think if they break our walls, they break us, but we are not walls, we are not wires, we are breath, we are patience, we are truth, and truth doesn't break." A roar surged from the men, fierce and defiant. They tightened their line, lifted their rifles, and braced for the next wave. The enemy crashed against them like a storm against stone. Gunfire erupted, explosions tore the earth apart, screams cut through the night. Ara moved among her men, calm where they were chaos, steady where they faltered. She guided their fire, adjusted their barrels, whispered their courage back into them. One soldier, barely 20, froze as an enemy charged him. Ara stepped into the line of fire, dropped the attacker with a single shot, then shoved the boy's rifle back into his hands. "You're not a machine. You're a man. Fight like one." The boy swallowed hard, nodded, and fired again. This time he didn't miss. Hours blurred into eternity. The base was fire and smoke, mud and blood. Men fell. Others rose in their place. And through it all, Ara fought, relentless, her silence louder than any order, her presence the anchor that held them steady. By dawn, the valley was littered with wreckage and corpses. The enemy had broken against them, wave after wave, until finally the assault ebbed, the tide receding in smoke and silence. The base still stood, barely, but it stood. Soldiers staggered through mud, faces hollow with exhaustion, eyes wide with awe. They looked at Ara as if she were more than human, as if she had carried them all on her shoulders through the fire. Colonel Ree approached, his face drawn, his pride shattered and remade into something humbler. He saluted her, voice raw. "You didn't just hold the line, you were the line." Ara returned the salute, her expression steady. But inside, her chest ached with the weight of ghosts. She thought of the boy she had shot days before, of Darren, of every name carved into the memorial wall. She wondered how many more ghosts she could carry before they consumed her. As the sun rose over the valley, painting smoke and blood in shades of gold, Ara whispered to herself. The world asked. I answered. But at what cost? Her eyes lingered on her men, alive because she had chosen, killed, carried. Their respect burned in their gaze, but so did her burden. The battle was over, but her war was not. What happens after the storm? The question lingered in the ruins of forward operating base Ayler, where smoke curled like tired ghosts into the gray sky. The battle was over, but the silence it left behind carried more weight than the thunder of guns ever had. Soldiers walked like shadows through the mud, some carrying stretchers, some carrying only the weight of what they had survived. Ara moved among them, her rifle slung across her back, her face unreadable. They looked at her differently now. No smirks, no whispers, no dismissive glances. Their eyes held respect, even reverence. Some looked at her with gratitude so sharp it was almost painful. Others with fear, not of her, but of the truth she carried, that courage was not in machines, not in doctrines, but in flesh and breath, in patience and silence. Colonel Ree stood in the courtyard, flanked by officers from headquarters who had arrived too late to bleed, too clean to understand. They wrote notes, clipped words into reports, labeled chaos with phrases like engagement outcome and tactical deviation. They tried to reduce survival into numbers, but numbers couldn't explain why the base still stood. When they were finished, Ree turned to Ara, his voice rough with honesty. They'll call it comms failure, system sabotage, weather interference. They'll name it 100 things to keep themselves comfortable, but it wasn't any of that. It was courage, yours and theirs, because you gave it back to them. Ara's gaze didn't soften. Names don't matter, the truth does. The enemy broke our machines. They'll do it again. If we forget what we've learned, next time we won't survive. Ree followed her eyes. A half-circle of recruits stood nearby, listening, their faces open, their faith in her unshakable. The colonel gave a slow nod. Then you'll teach them. And she did. Training began the very next day, not on polished ranges or glowing screens, but on scarred ground where mud remembered more than men wanted to admit. Ara had them lie still for hours, not to shoot but to breathe. She made them watch grass lean before the wind even came, to predict silence before it broke. She showed them that pulling the trigger wasn't command but permission, permission granted only when the world itself agreed. Some soldiers failed, some cursed, some nearly broke under the patience she demanded, but slowly something changed. Their shots found steel targets salvaged from broken turrets. Their hands steadied, their fear quieted, and in their silence they began to learn what Ara already knew: truth is slower than machines but sharper. Malik, headset still dangling uselessly around his neck, stood at the range one evening, watching recruits hit steel without electronic guidance. He shook his head. I built sermons to blinking lights, he muttered. Maybe it's time I build a chapel to listening. Ara surprised him with a faint smile. Build both, just don't worship either. Even Colonel rejoined the training. He lay in mud beside the youngest recruits, his pride dissolving into humility. He missed his shots more often than not, But Ara corrected him the same as she corrected the rest. He never complained, perhaps because he knew he needed the lessons most of all. At dusk, the names of the dead were read again. The list was long, too long. Ara stood at the edge of the formation, her head bare to the cold, her hands clasped behind her back. When the last name was spoken, silence followed. Not the silence of mockery, not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of memory, of respect. It climbed into the rafters and stayed, a witness that would not leave. Afterward, Ree found her at the memorial board, her eyes on Darren's photo. "I used to talk to this wall," he admitted again, voice quiet. "When I didn't know what to tell living men, it never answered, not until now." Ara asked, "And what did it say back this time?" Ree swallowed. "That courage isn't downloaded, it's lived." Her lips curved almost into a smile. Almost. Days turned to weeks. The base began to rebuild. Towers were patched, barracks repaired, but scars remained, blackened stone, shattered steel, names carved deeper into wood. The soldiers carried themselves differently now, straighter, quieter, stronger. They no longer mocked Ara. They no longer dismissed her. They sought her. They asked for her corrections, her words, her silence. One evening, Colonel Ree called the soldiers into the yard for a ceremony. His voice carried into the cold night as flames flickered from torches. "This base stood because one woman refused to accept what the rest of us did," he said. "She reminded us that machines are tools, not crutches. She reminded us that silence can be stronger than noise. Tonight we honor Staff Sergeant Ara Villa, widow of war and teacher of the living." He turned to her, his salute sharp and unshaking. One by one, every soldier raised their hand. No laughter, no whispers, just silence and respect. Ara returned the salute with steady eyes. She didn't need applause. The silence was enough. Later that night, a young private approached her by the firelight. He was the same boy who had once sneered at her rifle, who had mocked her as grandma with a museum piece. His voice trembled as he asked, "Ma'am, will you ever forgive us for how we treated you before?" Ara studied him. Then she placed her hand lightly on the stock of her rifle. "There's nothing to forgive. You hadn't seen what truth looks like yet. Now you have. Carry it forward." The boy nodded, throat tight, and she knew he would never forget. 2 mornings later, orders came. Headquarters offered her a commission, an instructor's billet at the Capitol Academy, a chance to shape doctrine for the entire army, a life of clean halls, chalkboards, and speeches, a life far from mud, blood, and ghosts. Ara stared at the paper for a long time. Darren's voice echoed again in memory. "The world will ask you for more than grief. Give it what it asks." She could have taken the post. She could have left the scars and the silence behind. But she folded the paper, wrote a single line in reply, and sent it back. "My place is in the field. My students are here." Weeks later, on patrol in the hills, Ara paused at a ridge where the wind sang sharp and high. Around her, the squad she had trained moved with quiet precision, eyes sharp, steps measured. They were not the same boys who had once laughed at her. They were sharper, braver, freer. She crouched, resting Darren's rifle across her knees. A faint smile touched her lips as she looked at them. His rifle, his teachings, living now in the hands of others. The widow of war was no longer just Darren's memory. She had become a legacy, and legacies do not die. They carry forward, silent, unseen, unstoppable. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.